So, hi everyone. I'm super thrilled to be presenting to you about documentation. It's a hobby of mine. Hopefully everyone can see my screen, what I've got sharing.
Yep.
Um, I'm going to take
Okay.
that as success. Awesome. So let's get started. This is something I'm pretty passionate about. This is my presentation, Decoding Digital Documentation. Um, I am Jennifer Dust. I'm a full stack developer here at Aten Design Group. So my background is actually in higher education and working with non-for-profit organizations such as Girls Who Code. I've had the privilege to work as a web developer and teach computer science at the collegiate level for several years. Having completed two different master's degrees, I have certainly learned a lot of ways of how not to write, which is pretty great because what I'm going to do today is pass along some of the things that I've learned to you guys. So, what are we going to cover today? During our session, we're going to look at ineffective versus effective documentation and how to identify the differences between them. We want to focus on setting up your writing for success through outlines and planning with how to prepare for different types of projects. Then lastly, we're going to take and apply these concepts to existing documentation examples as a demonstration of how they can improve your communication. Pretty good stuff. So I know that we're on Zoom, but if anybody wants to throw out in the chat, how many times have you picked up a project and the documentation left you with more questions than answers? I know you guys can't necessarily see me, but I promise I'm raising my hand. Me too. I've had a lot of situations where I've picked something up, a project, and I'm not quite sure what's going on or how to follow up with who wrote it. Most documentation is written with the hopes that it will help somebody in the future understand a process, specific tool, or software. However, there are several things that can cause documentation to be ineffective, which isn't great. Nobody loves ineffective documentation. It's super frustrating. So let's take a look at what some of those issues might actually be. Here's a short list you can use as a guide to compare documentation against. Having no documentation. This could be because of timing issues or concerns over how to start, no visual aids or images in your documentation. Documentation consisting of only text can make it hard for users to read and follow along. Speaking of difficult to navigate and search, users struggle to find what they're looking for. And does your current structure actually make sense navigation wise? Like, how does a user plan to use this? Unhelpful naming conventions. Not following a concise naming structure or having undescriptive names make it difficult to find things. Inaccessible content. Do you actually know if your content's accessible, or have you ever written with accessibility in mind? Outdated content. When was the last time your documentation was updated, and how do you track this information? Is it consistent, reliable? And the wrong audience. Who is the documentation written for? Does it support all of the required needs or what was really expected from the documentation when it was written? That's a decent list for you guys to use, but let's take a deeper dive into what each of these items really mean. No documentation, nothing exists. This one's pretty easy to identify. Having no documentation is obviously not ideal. Usually we find ourselves in a situation like this because of time or budget constraints. Sometimes it's confusion over how to write or even start documentation projects. However, no documentation is its own starting point. You can take a step back and reevaluate the project or product that needs to be documented by going through outline and resource gathering process that we're going to cover later in this presentation. So don't worry, we have a solution for this one. No images or visual aids. There are a lot of situations where pictures and visual aids work better for explaining a task than just text. Images give users a visual cue that they can look for while following along. Here's an example that most people are pretty familiar with. I'm using it right now, creating a presentation using a template. So on the left-hand side, we've got a snippet of documentation that's all text-based and somewhat lacking clarity. We direct the user to a location with rough instructions on how to complete a task. So let's look at this. Create a new presentation using the slides template. Go to Google Drive, select new Google Slides from a template, Click conference presentation. Overall, I understand kind of what's going on here. Like the steps make sense, but they're actually not super clear. And if you try to do this right now, they don't actually work. It's not easy to follow or super intuitive. However, looking at the right-hand side, we've clarified the instructions by adding the template gallery button. And by doing so, we've created a visual anchor for the users to follow along with. We've also clarified some of the language you'll see here to create a new presentation using the slides template. So go to Google Drive, select new Google Slides, click on template gallery button. And we've got that visual cue right there. Like, oh, okay, I know what I'm looking for. I've gotten here. This is what I'm expecting to see as a user. Click the conference presentation template file. Visuals like this can be key in helping someone navigate and comprehend what's being explained. They play a larger role in guides and technical documentation, which definitely include more complex steps. Difficulty navigating and searching. If your documentation's in a repository tool such as Notion or Confluence, how hard is it to find what you're looking for? Really, how long does it take users to find relevant content? Documentation structures often utilize a hierarchy-based organization, which is a simple structure for outlining content by groups. However, having things deeply nested or buried within other groups makes it difficult to navigate and maintain in the long run. To avoid this, I recommend grouping topics together in a flat hierarchy. That avoids grouping groups containing groups. We've all seen it. If you look on the example here on the left, on the right-hand side, we've got our product and then detailed sub information, more information, and there's our step-by-step. But how many levels as a user did I have to go down to find this information? In tandem with using a straightforward structure, it's also important to allow users to search for content on their own and provide them with a method of doing so. Now, this isn't always possible, but documentation without any search function offers a frustrating experience. I'm sure we've all encountered this at least once where you can't really find what you're looking for, or there isn't a search bar and you have to like Control F and find your way through the content. To support a good user search experience, let's actually take a look at naming conventions. Unhelpful naming conventions. These can be a pitfall no matter the type of project. When creating headings or labels, you want to use descriptive language in relevant and consistent ways. This ensures that the labels and headings are meaningful when read out of context. And for example, when jumping from heading to heading within a page or searching an entire document, people can easily get to the content they want without having to waste time wading through several sections beforehand. In this example, on the left-hand side, it's difficult to scan the options because they all start with similar texts that don't accurately relate to what's being covered within. We've got our content structure, add content, delete content. Oh, okay, I have an idea. User accounts, add role, add user, remove user, role permissions, and role changes. Well, again, I have a rough idea of what's being covered, but looking at the more detailed example on the right, we see differences such as remove user actually becomes deactivating a user account. It's not the same thing as deleting. And you see another example there is role permissions becomes assigning permissions to a role. So take a step back and look at the content again on the left. Based on the text alone as a user, I would expect to see a list of role permissions, not how to assign them. It's really important to use this descriptive language, especially at the heading level, so that your users have a better understanding of what the section covers without having to scan it bit by bit. Inaccessible content. So having accessible content is actually incredibly important. In fact, several of the things we've already covered help make your content more accessible. But here's a specific list highlighting a few important ones that you should keep in mind. Adding accurate and concise alternative text on images with content helps support any screen reader users you might have. Addressing color contrast for visual elements. Color should not be the only means of communicating important information to a visual user. Those who are colorblind need to have other ways to distinguish information in case differentiation of color is difficult for the user to see. So this goes beyond this goes for non-visual users as well. Imagine your document was being printed in black and white. Can users still understand what's being displayed? If not, then text or patterns need to be implemented along with color. Or another option would be to supply a more data-driven approach to the infographic, such as an accessible table. In the example at the bottom of this slide, you can see 3 different pie charts. The left relies on color alone. The middle and the right have had their color saturation removed to show the difficulty of only using color to differentiate between the sections. Not the easiest to tell exactly what's going on just by looking at that middle example. But by adding the patterns in the right-hand chart, you can actually use that instead of color to read each section. And this isn't a difficult thing to add. So continuing, avoiding vague links. So use descriptive link text here. We've all seen those links of learn more or click here, but a user should actually be able to know exactly where a link goes based on the text alone. In this top example, we call out for the users to learn more with no real context as to what they're learning about. Just read that top line. All time off approvals need to go through direct managers. Learn more. Okay, as a user, I think that relates to my PTO or time off or something like along those lines. But in the example right below that, by using more descriptive text, we realize that the link's actually encouraging us to learn more about their volunteer programs. Completely different context, completely different meaning. All time off approval needs to go through direct managers. Learn more about our volunteer programs. Avoid underlying text when you're working on the web. This is pretty important. Emphasizing content is a common thing we do, but it's recommended to avoid using underlying text as a form of emphasis because we all know that underlying text is a universal sign for a link. So instead, use bold or italics when you want to emphasize something. What's great about building these habits too is that when you check your documentation content for accessibility, it works on your website. Not only does this help screen readers and navigation, but it's a great way to boost your SEO. Outdated content. So maybe you already have documentation, but you aren't sure when it was written or last updated. It could be years ago. Outdated documentation is a problem, especially if the content is a tutorial or guide that may have had visual changes. If you're using a system that doesn't support version control, take a look at the timestamp or publication date and note when it was last updated, or if those things even exist. I recommend reviewing your documentation at least once a year. You can make this task more manageable by reviewing pieces throughout the year rather than all at once. Personally, I actually like to break things up into smaller sections and set things aside a little bit of time every month just to review a section as a whole. It helps me stay on top of content that may have changed, and it just keeps things continually up to date. After you've updated your content, make sure that any of the visual dates are updated as well. This helps your users know that they're getting the most recent version, and you can also keep track of when things were last updated. Ideally, you'd be able to use a version control system that would display the latest version of your document and help alleviate any fear of missing critical changes that may have been made. But I totally understand that that's not always the case. So visual dates help a lot. Writing for the wrong audience. Documentation can be confusing, especially when it's written without the right audience in mind. Define your user. Who is this documentation actually for? And who's going to use it? Ideally, you'll already have a rough idea, but it's a good question to confirm. Looking beyond who's going to use it, how do they expect to use it? Sometimes things get created with best intentions, but they don't actually meet the use case, right? When feature in doing so creates a really frustrating experience. By addressing this question, you make sure to have everything that's expected documented. Our project managers here and sales team often write process-based documentation, and that focuses on creating timelines for the development process or explaining a new feature or service we offer. Process documentation focuses on the development of a product, not the product itself. It outlines a sequence of steps that have to be followed. And some examples are timelines or project requirements, which I'm sure we've all made at some point. Now, as a developer, I actually write product-based documentation, focusing on a finished product or how to use and understand something. You see this type of documentation pretty frequently with like user guides and technical architecture. Developers, we see it a lot with API documentation or in release notes. Both of these, though, are still documentation, but with widely different audiences, meaning that the type of language and the format we use is going to be different. So we need to plan for that. And speaking of, now that we've looked at some of the ways that make documentation ineffective, let's take a deeper look at how we can actually create effective documentation. Plan for success. So confidence is key. Well, that and good planning. How do we craft documentation in a way that sets us up for success? I'm so glad you guys asked. What do we need? We need to identify specific needs of a project that should address and outline these things. Any minute things, if not documented, that could cause a problem later should absolutely be written down. Earlier, we talked about audiences, and here they are again. Who are we writing for? That's a question that we should ask early on and frequently. This helps us align the format of our writing and set us up for success. Do we have any outstanding resources or documentation to work from? We want to make sure that we gather as much information as possible so that we don't duplicate documentation. And are there existing tools or style guides that we're required to use? Do we write all of our documentation in Google Docs, Confluence, Notion? Is there some other tool that your organization has? Is there a style guide that already exists setting you up for specific expectations that your company has? And do you know where that file lives or when it was last updated? And then lastly, what's the timeline? Everything we write, everything we do is going to have a timeline. When does this need to be completed by? And are you going to write throughout the development process? Or is this something needs to be completed at the end of a product, the beginning of a project? All of these questions should be addressed prior to ever starting any of your documentation. Creating outlines. So when you start with new documentation, I recommend planning it by creating a rough outline using a flat hierarchy to group topics together, meaning that nothing is nested within another group, or at least you try to avoid it as much as possible. And then you think about the flow of your content. Does the progression actually make sense for users? And what might your audience be expecting with regards to progression? This is a great point in your development of your documentation to check with those users. Remember when I said ask the audience what they're expecting? This is where you would want to validate those expectations. How do they want to use this content? How do they expect to use this content? And does that flow make sense to a reader? If you're editing existing documentation, take note of the current structure and flow of the content. Does it make sense as is, or could simplifying the format improve overall readability? A really good exercise would be take a piece of documentation that you have and cut it down to just a basic outline. Does its structure hold up and make sense in that format? If it does, great, awesome, 10 out of 10. You guys are doing good. But if it doesn't, it's time to edit. It's time to take a look at that and really break down why doesn't this flow of content make sense, or can I restructure or remove some of those nested elements from within? Reviewing and adjusting your content for clarity is really important because a lot of the times we come into organizations that have documentation already and it's just that it's not super helpful. This piece right here where you take it and you break it down into that outline really helps set you up for success and plan all of the things you're going to write going forward. So what makes clear communication? We've gathered all this information, we have our rough outline, and now it's time to actually write. But what does that look like, or what does that really mean? Be concise. Okay, well, explain how things work, but do so in as straightforward as possible. If you're confused explaining something, get help and figure it out, but outlining something so that it makes sense and all of what needs to be covered is there without any additional extra pieces that aren't really helpful to that exact topic you're writing about. If you're writing something that's super detailed or complex, try breaking it down into smaller steps. By doing so, you can transform your content, which would have been difficult for users to read, into components that are easier to comprehend. We've all seen this where it's a really long tutorial and it just kind of goes on and on. But by breaking that stuff into steps, it's easier for us to say, okay, well, I've completed steps 1 through 3. What's next? Don't repeat yourself. As a programmer, this is something I strive to do all the time. I'm not always successful, but writing code and documentation in a way that ensures we don't end up with duplicate work is ideal. This ties back to our step of figuring out what we actually need. By spending that time then to research what already exists, we can alleviate some of that duplication. And it just makes things easier so that they don't get, you don't update something in one spot and forget 2 weeks later to update it somewhere else. Active voice versus passive voice is something that people don't think about a lot of the time when writing documentation. Utilizing active voice makes things clear to the user that they're the main acting party with less room for misinterpretation. Active voice gives us ownership of the actions that we're taking while reading through that documentation. It's an important step to make sure that your users have ownership of what they're reading because they feel like it applies to them and they can follow those steps or do whatever process it is that's outlined with a sense of ownership. Avoiding unclear words. If you ever find yourself using vague terms to describe something, it's time to reevaluate what you're actually describing. Take a step back and go and review your outline and say, okay, this is what I really mean, and figure out how to write that in a clear, concise way. And lastly, if you have a style guide, follow it. If you don't have a style guide, that's totally okay. Try to keep your writing styles and formatting simple and consistent. Let's actually, you know what? Let's take a look at some writing styles, formatting and styles. So setting a standard for writing styles, fonts, and formatting is imperative for success when it comes to large scale documentation. And while it may seem like a minor thing, it's actually really important to have that consistency, especially when you have lots of people contributing to your product or content. This is true in open source. That's why you see so many of those style documentation guides of this is what they're expecting. Your guide doesn't have to be fancy or ornate. It just has to be consistent. On the left-hand side, we've got an example of documentation with varying styles and formats. First off, that's a lot to look at. We see that browsers is underlined. However, I'm pretty sure that's a header and not a link. So first off, that doesn't make sense. And second, that's an accessibility concern. As we keep reading, you see that the font format changes. We've got size changes. There's different formats between the two list items. One's using bullet points, one's using numbers. We've got italicized versus just bolded. Completely different font families here. It's a lot to read. It's very busy and it's not easy to follow or kind of get what I'm looking at. But let's shift and take a look at the left-hand side. This is just simplicity created by a consistent typeface, font size, and format. It's that much easier to read, and we're not taking away from what's being documented with a myriad of styles and formats. So this is a super simple step that anybody can implement at any level or point in your documentation adventure here, is just go through and review the styles that are being used in your documentation. I've actually set up an expanded example using basic text styles and formatting here to create a structure within documentation. So let's break this down. We've got our heading and title. So it's a little bit bolded and larger than our body text. We've got some body text underneath with an example link using detailed language. And then we've got this unordered list with bullet points. We've got a call out with that little bolded notice. And then we've got an ordered list. Now that's probably telling me that this is a series of steps that I need to follow. So this is not a detailed or ornate setup in terms of your documentation, but it's pretty easy to follow. As a visual user, I can say, okay, I've got an idea. That's what I'm looking for. Here's the stuff. Nothing is drawing away from what I'm trying to read. When you're creating a document with a specific writing tool, such as like Markdown or Confluence or Notion, following this kind of basic format gives you a visual consistency. Now, this is the last step I've got, although I would argue it's an incredibly important one on reviewing and testing what you're written. So this is something that doesn't happen a lot, especially with documentation where it's down to the last second and we've got to get this written and cover as much as possible. Take a step back. This is super important. Whenever possible, I recommend having documentation reviewed by other team members, ideally someone that's not familiar with what's being documented. And the reasoning for that is that they're going to catch things that you're not anticipating. A really quick test you can do is if you have at least 2 other people, have them read through your content. Now, programmers, this could be other programmers that you know, or a marketing team. This could be content reviewers. Just pass something over and say, hey, does this make sense? Please read through it. And it's not going to be super long, and it could take, 15 minutes. But at the end of when they've read through it, do they agree on what was being communicated? Can they tell you, oh, yeah, I totally get that this is the policy document, or oh, I understand that this function works this way, or I may not understand the code underneath, but I get the general idea because of your documentation. And then if they can tell you it was easy to understand and they agree, awesome. That's a super benefit. That tells you you've written in a format that's easy to understand regardless of who's reading it. And another benefit of testing is that it lets you get that kind of feedback, and you can make sure that the goal of your documentation, that thing we said at the very beginning, was actually achieved. Plus, you can identify like confusing language or important steps. I know that there's been a couple of things I've written where, to me as a developer, okay, obviously this is what we do next. And I've given it to a content creator and they're like, how do I write this? Like, where is this stuff? And I realized that what might be intuitive to me because I'm constantly working in Drupal or I'm constantly working in whatever the CMS is, isn't something that the other person was expecting. And so that important step was missing. So throughout this presentation, I'm sure there are some of you that have been thinking, that's great. I already have existing documentation. How do I make that better? Well, let's take a look. I've actually crafted a few examples that we can walk through and see how applying some of the concepts we've talked about improve the clarity and effectiveness of your documentation. So here's an email signature example. Let's take a look at what's going on here. Everyone's Gmail should match the template below. You may need to copy and paste the signature from someone else. Reach out if you need help. And we see Jane Doe, SEO specialist at this demo company. Okay. Well, already I don't have a descriptive header, so I'm not really sure what this section is. I guess it's about your email signature. Cool, cool. The last line says to reach out for help, but doesn't actually point me where to go or who to reach out to. So it's a call to action, but not really. And there's a reference to copying the signature from others. Well, where's the code? Where's the code in this documentation? Because if you've written documentation and I have to go ask somebody if I could copy their email signature, it's not great. It's not great documentation. So now that we've identified what needs work, let's take a look at applying what we've been talking about. So here's an updated example. How to update your Gmail signature. Awesome. Inside Gmail, navigate to General Settings. Scroll down to the Signature section. Copy and paste the code snippet below. Please reach out to Steve if you need assistance. Steve@mountains.io. Gmail signature code. Enter the following HTML in your email signature field, using your details where appropriate. And I see that there's a block of content there and an example of what it should look like when I'm done. Overall, a lot easier to understand. We've added section headings, which could help define the content and allow users to scan for what they need quickly. If I'm coming to this as a user and I'm just going through our documentation and searching Gmail signature code, I'd be able to find that block right away. The call to action's been replaced with somebody to actually contact. Their email address is right there, readily available. Now, this doesn't have to be a specific person, right? This could be my HR, this could be our technical department. It just needs to be somebody that could be reached. We've given a call to action with an action they can follow up on. And instead of finding someone with the code that we need to copy, it's now included right there in the documentation. Thank goodness, because that would have been an adventure, an email chain of trying to get someone else's signature. So while there weren't many changes that we made, in fact, there were really only 3 big ones, it had a dramatic effect on that content itself. As a user, I can find what I'm looking for, follow through steps, or get assistance if I need, just by those 3 edits. Here's another example we've all seen in a company handbook or policy document. Similar kind of concept. This one has headings. Expenses and reimbursement policy. Okay, good. Demo Mountain Company will reimburse reasonable company approved business expenses. Expenses must be pre-approved by our managers or HR. After approval, all expenses should be submitted via Expensify, and receipts need to be uploaded, and employees should provide a detailed description of the expense, including a project tag, client tag, and billable tag. Whew, okay. Expenses must be submitted within 1 month of the receipt date, and any submitted late will not be reimbursed. So, all right, that's a lot. Right off the bat, there's a few issues. The header is the same size as the rest of the text, so it makes it difficult to distinguish when the section starts and stops. I actually thought if it weren't for that bullet point there, expenses must be pre-approved by managers, could have been another heading. Active voice is not being used throughout this policy, meaning I don't feel any kind of sense of ownership. Okay, employees need to do that. Neat. Good job. Does that apply to me? Oh, okay. That's the difference between having an active and a passive voice. It looks like at some point the link for Expensify was updated, but the formatting was changed to whatever got pasted in. It seems to be some sort of serif-based font. And we see that there's some differences going along with regards to the bullet points. They're a different style or format. And the call out regarding the 1 month timeline only seems to be relying on color, which even on my screen as I sit here is kind of hard to see. So, okay, let's make some changes. Already easier to read. We've updated the header to a correct size. It stands out from the rest of the text. I can easily scan and go, cool, that's our section header, and keep going. We've changed our writing style to use an active voice. So what does that look like? Expenses must be pre-approved by your manager in HR. Employees will upload a receipt and provide detailed description of the expense. So we've given that ownership back to the person who's reading this. Okay, so that it needs to be my manager and I will upload a receipt. We've removed the external formatting and updated some of the styles. So now that link, that Expensify link matches the rest of it. The bullet points are no longer random colors or styles. We also broke up the longer bullet points for readability. So employees will upload a receipt and provide detailed description of the expense. Okay, cool. Include a project tag, client tag, and billable tag if applicable. So I know that I need to upload a receipt and provide details. Here's some of those details that they could be. We also changed the 1 month call out to no longer rely on color alone for that emphasis. So it's bolded and it's the color red. So now, even if I took all the saturation out of the page and printed this in black and white, I know that the 1 month is super important. Branch workflows. So this is an example more for the developers on the call. This is documenting an organization's workflow with regards to feature branches and database pulls. This documentation, I'll tell you, technically covers what's being asked, but it's not very clear or easy to understand. So let's walk through it. Create a new branch off main. Push code changes to that branch. Merge into dev. Once dev approved, merge into staging. After QA approval, deploy changes to main. Note, databases only go backwards in dev. Don't overwrite the main database. Okay, that seems important. What makes this ineffective documentation? Well, right off the bat, we're missing our heading. And we've got an incorrect use of some sort of setup here. It's not super easy to understand what's being explained or visualize. And I don't really know what the purpose is of that note section or why it's included at the bottom there. That seems really important. Beyond that, we're not using descriptive enough language. If somebody who wasn't a developer came and read this, or was a new developer, let's say it's a trainee and you're mentoring someone, or you're passing this off to a client's internal house dev, they may be able to follow this, but it's not clear enough that I can understand and visualize what's expected here. So let's make some changes. We've already added a header, feature branch workflow. A new feature branch should be created off the production codebase, main. During development, the feature branch may be merged into development branch for dev testing. When dev work is complete, merge the feature branch into staging for quality acceptance and testing. After testing and approval, the feature branch can then be merged into production. Okay, so reading that is dramatically more clear. We've broken down the steps into easy format. We've elaborated in ways that help clarify the concept and idea. Reading the comments out loud, it's made sense and it's concise. They've also added a visual, an image or a diagram where it's useful, and like we've mentioned before, not everything needs a diagram, but when you're doing something that's complex or very specific, it can help people who learn visually, and it's a powerful tool when crafting documentation to teach something, like in this instance. They've also updated the note to make a lot more sense. During the development, pull databases back towards relevant environment, never pull databases forward. This protects the production database from being overridden. So I can look at that I can look at the workflow in the text on the left, and I can look at the image here on the right. And I can see, okay, the code from the feature branch is getting sent to all of those branches. And I can see the databases being pulled backwards. Even if I didn't have the text there on the left, the visual gives me an understanding of, okay, cool. These go this way. I never pull something in a different direction, or I don't want to commit something that I shouldn't. It's added that context and that visual anchor for your user to follow along with. So remember, when writing documentation, these are the 3 important ideas I'd recommend. Identify what your documentation needs are. Outline them in a concise and straightforward format, and write using clear communication.